koutou katoa, ko Megan Gallagher toko ingoa, ke Sustainable Business Council aho I mahi ana. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session, The Business of Nature, why Papatūānuku needs to be our CEO. A big thank you to the Auckland Climate Festival for including us in their program, and to this wonderful panel of people, Tahu, Robin and Kim, for their time, passion and dedication to this work. The Sustainable Business Council is a membership organisation with a purpose to mobilise Aotearoa's most ambitious businesses to build a thriving and sustainable future for all. In the world of environmental sustainability, climate has long been front and centre, and we are now seeing growing focus on nature and biodiversity. Nature is a critical part of our past, present and future. The biodiversity strategy of Aotearoa says it beautifully. Ina raru ana te taio, ki te raru hoki tātou. When nature is in trouble, so are we. Given the impact that climate change has been having on the environment, both in Aotearoa and around the world, we can probably all agree that nature is in trouble. Today's session aims to explore the opportunity and responsibility that business has in restoring the Māori of nature. It is my pleasure to hand over to Tahu Sterling for a karakia before our panel introduce themselves. Kia ora, Tahu.
Kia ora, Megan. Kia ora koutou katoa. Karakia tīmataka. Kia tau te raki Māori o te raki e tū iho nei, o Papatūānuku e takuto nei, o te moana nui a kiwa e tautoko nei, o te tai ao e awhi nei, ki runga i a tātou, kia pai te huarahi o tātou, kia ora tātou katoa. May peace and harmony of the Sky Father above, of the Earth Mother below, of the Pacific Ocean that sustains us, of the all-embracing natural world be bestowed upon us all. May we all journey well. Greetings. Well, greetings everybody. My name is Tahu Portiki Sterling, and I am the Māori Development Advisor at the Lyttleton Port Company. And it is indeed my privilege to be part of the webinar with my distinguished guests, colleagues, Dr. Robin Mitchell and Kim Gallagher. But first, a little pepeha, a little introduction of myself. Ko auraki te mauka, ko waitaki te awa, ko Ngāti Wheke, ko kararata, nai tuahuriri, whanau maru oku hapu, ko nai tahu Ngāti Parau, whanau apanui, oku iwi, ko tahu Portiki Sterling ahau, kua hau te kai whakahaere Māori o te kamapene whakaraupo, ko Marcia ni Drinan taku ho rangatira, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And I'll now hand it over to Robin.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name's Robin Mitchell. I come from England originally, born and raised in England, and came to New Zealand 20-some years ago on a Commonwealth scholarship. And I've had the pleasure to work with business, leading businesses since near the beginning of my career, some 25 years ago, and have seen a big journey in that time. And it's really exciting to see the momentum that's building now. And so I'd just like to start.
Robin, if we just go to for introductions as well, and then Tahu.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, so it's been really exciting to see that journey, and looking forward to hearing people's perspectives. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Kim Gallagher aho. I head up Lyttleton Port's environmental and sustainability programs, and my background is in coastal environmental science. I've kind of worked most of my career in infrastructure businesses, in ports and airports. And I guess just a little bit around the connection between Rob and Tahu and I. We're all currently working together on Lyttleton Port's nature strategy. I first connected with Robin a few years ago when we were trying to work out how we would approach a nature positive strategy, and Robin assisted us with developing some sort of high level roadmap and understanding about how we would approach things. But we're now all working together on applying the science-based targets for nature process, and also the TNFD, which Robin will talk in more detail about. And of course, Tahu is my colleague here at LPC, and he's guiding and exploring with us and with Mana Whenua how we might integrate mātauranga into this process that we're working on. So you're all in for a real treat today, because Tahu's going to kick us off and get us rolling by sharing his story of whānau, whakapapa and mātauranga. So over to you, Tahu.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, now I'm going to try and share. Kia ora anō, thank you very much. Sorry about that. Thanks to Kirsty. I wanted to start by telling a story about my grandfather, Eruera Kapia Whakatāne Sterling. Now my grandfather was born in Raukokore, a little wee seaside settlement 50 kilometres past Tukaha in the Bay of Plenty. His mother was Mihi Kutukutuku, was a chieftainess of the Whānau Apanui tribe, and she had married Duncan Sterling, who was a builder from Riverton down in South Island, because the name Sterling comes from bluff, of course, Sterling Point, to be exact. The purpose of my talking about the presentation, I'm going to, my grandfather was a great orator, and I want to recite his chant in keeping with the age-old process of karakia and mihi mihi, which is about tikanga and the right way of doing things. So just go through it and I'll explain. Te hei mauri ora, whakarongo whakarongo, whakarongo ki te tangi a te manu nei e karanga nei, tui tui, tui tuia, tui e runga, tui e raro, tui e roto, tui e waho, tui e te here takata, karango te pō, karanga te pō, tuia e te kāwai tangata e heke mai nei, i hawe ki nui, a hawe ki roa, i hawe ki pamau. Te hona ki te wairua, ki te whaiao, ki te ao marama, te hei mauri ora. Often these sort of chants were said at the beginning of a speech on the marae, but you can sort of see that there are sort of links in the way that it brings everything together. For example, he's talking about listening to the cry of the bird, calling out, unite, unite, unite above, unite below, unite without, and unite within. So it's bringing together Papatūānuku, the Sky Father as well, and without it, all those elements of nature that are outside of that, and then within us as well, and then the descent lines of people, so that we are all intricately connected. And it also talks about the descent lines from Hawaii, Great Hawaii, Hawaii far away, and along Hawaii. So those ancestral lands. So all these sort of tie together to create this understanding of unity with both people and the natural environment. So in doing that, my grandfather, he was born on the East Coast on the beach, and he was an amazing man. But when he was 3 years old, an old queer, Hiria Te Rangi Haiata, and her husband took my grandfather into the bush, and they schooled him on whakapapa, genealogy, mātauranga Māori, living in the forest. The birds were his friends, all those sorts of things for 5 years, which is the most impressionable time for anybody. As we know, children learn so much within those first 5 years. So my grandfather learnt about the whakapapa. And the point I want to say here that whakapapa is mātauranga Māori. The term mātauranga Māori literally means Māori knowledge as we know, and it's closely aligned to the period of pre-European contact. And Māori traditional knowledge is multidisciplinary, creating something by thinking across the boundaries and holistic, not that which is known by the mind, but rather that which is where the mind is known, is part of that sort of holistic approach to people and to the environment. So it does include environmental guardianship and economic development with the purpose of preserving Māori culture and improving the quality of life for Māori people over time. So mātauranga Māori has also been recently acknowledged and recognised in the scientific community. And a good example of that is Rangi Matamua, who was made a professor of mātauranga Māori at Massey University. And the reason why I talk about him is because he not only brought in sort of the holiday, but he also brought in a resurgence of people wanting to know more about Matariki and the Māori New Year. Wayfinding navigation was also, which Sir Ian Taylor talks about as being a science, is another area of knowledge that has been revised by Heke, what's his name now? Heke Busby. So that's in regards to the waka haurua, the canoes that travel the length and breadth of the Pacific. So in the 21st century, of course, kaitihiakitanga is being used in addressing environmental issues, partnering with iwi. Other customary areas of knowledge are whanaungatanga, manakitanga, kotahitanga, rangateratanga, maramatanga, and wairuatanga. That is by no means the whole extent of it. There's quite a few more as well. But I wanted to show you, so when my uncle was, my grandfather was taken into the bush, this is the little whare that he grew, and where he learned about the whakapapa. He also had strong beliefs about whakapapa because it linked us to the people and to the land. Whakapapa was a way of life for him, as he often called upon by the Māori land courts to clarify ownership of lands and to help sort out disputes and things like that. He was also one of Aotearoa Ngāta's key men in the real sector, but he developed a healthy interest in genealogy of other people, and one of them is the whakapapa of kings and queens of England. This was something that he just did as a matter of interest for him. But, you know, he was conferred with a doctorate when he was in around about 1980, I believe it was, in literature, because he wrote 3 books based on the knowledge that he had obtained over the years from being a young man to older person. And the next person I wanted to sort of talk to about was, next part of my story is about my father, Lopata Waha Waha Sterling. The reason why I chose these people is because it just closer to people that I know, and I sort of felt that they were good examples of, you know, learning mātauranga Māori and taking it into the new world, the modern era, particularly with my dad. So he was born in 1926 and grew up in the farm, milking cows 4 a.m. in the morning, and then riding horses to school and that sort of thing. It was a different world, and one in which a lot of men at the time wanted to actually travel and get out and about. And so when the war, World War II, arose, he wanted to enlist. He was only 15 at the time. But he eventually got into the territorials, and he ended up in the 28th Māori Battalion, where he went into the battle of for Italy. After the war ended, my dad ended up coming to Christchurch, and where there was an arranged marriage with my mum, and that was organised. My mum's name is Annie Wiramina Niho, and they had 6 kids. So Dad worked on the wharf at Lyttleton Harbour for over 20 years, whereby his nickname was the mini judge of all things, because he was always sitting on a case, which is a bit of a joke there. You're allowed to laugh if you like, but bit of a dry one. Anyway, look, within the Aotearoa, he was groomed for succession by the then Upoka Manawatu, and he subsequently became the leader in the 1950s, and following the death of Kitch Hopper and people like that. The Runaka had always been closely concerned with the provision of social services, and Dad was part of that whole process for about 40 years. And then in the 1980s, he had been a South Island Māori advisor for both the Minister of Social Welfare and Director General of Social Welfare. So you can see that already he'd sort of built up quite a lot of experience in working in the community, as well as working at the port, while he was working at the port. So it's good that he was able to have that sort of free time at times to go away to do things. And then, of course, in the 1980s, with the Resource Management Act reforms came to the fore, Dad and other scholars, elders of Aotearoa played a fundamental role in formulating the Māori component of, excuse me, I think I'm going to have the cough. Component of what then became the 1991 Resource Management Act. So he had the rare distinction of following his father, who received an honorary doctorate from Auckland University in 1903, and Dad was given an honorary doctorate by Lincoln University for his work in regards to the Resource Management Act. And a lot of the whānau agreed that Dad obtained a lot of sort of mātauranga Māori from his father that enabled him to be able to carry it on and provide that information to Lincoln University and subsequently the Resource Management Act input. So we're all very proud of my father, but I just also want to, just before I finish up, is just talk quickly about another person who's been very good for us is Henry Couch, and he's a splendid example of the Māori environmental champion who brought up in Rapaki, and we're very, very happy and very lucky to have 75 years of his experience of living in Lyttleton Harbour and being able to determine the type of fish and that were caught at the time. So he was also part of the customary fisheries declared Rapaki as a mātauranga, and he was also one of the first kaitiaki, the acknowledge officers of them. Okay, so I've got to go. So thank you very much for everything, and all the best to everybody. Thank you.
Robin, you're up next if you'd like to share your slide.
Sure. Thanks so much to Tahu. And yeah, just as a link, I really think that we are in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in a very fortunate position as we advance this nature journey for society and business, to be able to join the two knowledge systems of science and mātauranga Māori puts us, I think, in a very strong position. So I'd like to start just by thinking about a bit of a longer time frame. No need to look at all the detail here, of the journey of how we've got to where we've come to today. So really what I want to present here is you know, at the top you've got sort of the societal expectations in general, but specifically of business in terms of law and agreements that have been reached, and you know, different organisations that have to do with nature. And below I've put sort of some of perhaps the business responses, partly responses to that evolution, but also some of their own initiatives. And I think the key message here is that, you know, to recall the historical context, it's not that long ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, that there was no expectation upon business activity, upon profit-making activity to be socially positive. Many businesses relied on the labour of slaves, of course. And, you know, so that's where we were not so long ago. And there's an evolution towards, you know, an expectation of being socially positive. And of course, we still have a journey to travel on that to truly see that happening. And then perhaps starting in the 1980s, I would say, with more stringent environmental safeguards coming in response to various, you know, crises, acid rain, etc., we started to see some milestones coming in. The first safeguards of the World Bank Group were a huge milestone. And then, of course, the Rio Conventions in 1992 of biodiversity, climate change and desertification. And I would say that since perhaps 2012, in the last decade, we've really seen an acceleration. Once again, the World Bank were leaders with their performance standards that came out in 2012 that had a lot of specific requirements on biodiversity. And we saw those requirements come all the way through into private finance and into government law in terms of impact assessment. And even the Pope in 2015, I would argue that the Christian worldview of man having dominion over nature perhaps has not been helpful. However, the Pope's letter, Laudato Si, really turned that around. So in the last decade, we've seen a lot of progress in this area. And now in the last few years, of course, we've seen the linkage of nature and the climate agenda. And this has culminated in having a global goal for nature, which has been discussed and developed over the last few years, and hopefully will be agreed in 2 months' time at the Convention of Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties. And currently more than 350 businesses from around the world are participating actively in that process and actually pushing for governments to adopt ambitious targets for nature. And independently, there are also business groups, Business for Nature is one, who are already setting goals and targets by themselves towards nature recovery. And this is a graph from the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, and essentially illustrates what nature positive is. It's simply to measurably halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 and set a trajectory for recovery by 2050. Some key definitions. I won't talk about all of these. The key ones are, of course, biodiversity. It's very simple. The variety of all life on Earth. And ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people. really is just recognizing the huge variety of things that nature gives us, from spiritual to cultural to obviously the provision of all sorts of services that we rely on for our well-being and quality of life. And the other key concept here is that of natural capital, and that joins biodiversity and ecosystem services. Biodiversity in the kind of asset language being a stock, and services being the flow. That's what gives us natural capital. And nature-based solutions are really being seen as one of the answers to help to build natural capital as a solution to both biodiversity and nature crises. But the drivers for business to engage in this agenda, in the nature positive agenda, I'm trying to think about a simple way of putting it. I think in my experience there are three, and I'm just going to go one slide of each of these. Risk and cost on the first, and so this is risk or cost to businesses themselves. The resilience of the business into the long term to whatever challenges they see in their business models, and also well-being. So the first of those, and here I'm using the typology that people will probably be familiar with, the typology of risk that's come about through climate, the climate debate, and climate targets and climate disclosures. I've just adapted those four elements of that typology to biodiversity. And I think, to most people, physical risk is the most obvious. And with the floods we've seen of late, of course, we see the impact on infrastructure. Many of those assets owned by business, of course. Other things, pests and droughts, for agriculture, etc. So nature is obviously inextricably linked with that physical risk. Then transition, we're talking about here the massive change we're seeing, partly reflected on my timeline, in regulations, finance, requirements, and markets, consumer markets. We see a real convergence in requirements from those different sources. Systemic risk is a little harder to grasp, but ask the farmers in the US who have to bring bees in to pollinate their crops. That it's talking about sort of collapse thresholds, ecological thresholds that are passed, and then you see a collapse in a system and a loss of a service, or even legal liability. The UN recently passed a resolution for clean, healthy, and sustainable environment being a human right. So it'll be very interesting to see how law responds to that. And of course, reputation has long been a key driver for environmental performance for business. On the opportunity side, really, it's the flip side of the risk. And the key ones that we see most commonly are around operations. How can operations continue with minimal cost implications, and also, of course, supply chain. Getting the products and services that your business relies upon. Increasingly, we're seeing supply chain resilience being challenged by ecological issues around productivity to do with ecological status. Maintaining access to finance and getting access to cheaper finance and access to finance more quickly, and also even new markets around natural capital assets, nature markets, premium carbon credits, all these kind of things. So there's a real opportunity around sustainable finance and markets. And finally, an opportunity to not only meet but exceed regulations. Many of the business leaders are doing that and finding that they're able to capitalize on the reputational benefit of that basis. And then just down the bottom, I've just put there really to remind us that nature-based solutions, once again, incorporating both science perspectives and mātauranga Māori here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as to what a solution is and how to value nature, give massive opportunity in terms of tying together many strands of sustainability strategy, such as on climate mitigation, adaptation, water, and of course, nature to produce the well-being. And you know, it's important to think of broader well-being outcomes here for the business. So well-being within the business itself, of the businesses, of its employees and customers, but also as a corporate citizen, helping to deliver broader well-being outcomes. So here, just sort of summarising those. And you know, in terms of cultural and spiritual, we have, you know, Te Mana o Te Wai is a big development here in Aotearoa, and of course Mahanga Kai, an important indicator. Health and safety is a key aspect of wellbeing outcomes, and of course, you know, sustainable prosperity. And we're seeing a lot more on that in terms of New Zealand's economy, as embodied in the Living Standards framework, and quite clearly in the biodiversity strategy that links to our prosperity of thriving biodiversity. So that's the background as to what's happening and what the drivers are. And you know, so many businesses are starting to respond to that. And so wanted just to spend a few minutes on, well, okay, so if you're convinced that this is part of the strategy going forward, how do you, as a business, start that journey? I would say the first steps are really to define the business case. And here I think it's important to understand the concept of materiality. What is material? We talked about those risks and opportunities, to identify which are the most material risks and opportunities for your business, and to reflect on what the definition of material is for your business. So usually businesses have a very financial perspective on materiality, but I would propose that it's worth thinking more broadly than just financial, to think more about purpose, the purpose of the company, what being a corporate citizen means to the people that you're connected to, the customers, the staff, the community, and obviously the planet more broadly. And actually, if you think in the long term, you'll see links with all of those things through to profit, of course. Identifying who the champions are. This stuff isn't necessarily easy, certainly to begin with, and there needs to be champions, a champion or champions. And so identify who those are, incentivize them in some way and enable them. And then obviously, once you've done those two things, actually take the first steps. It is a journey. I would recommend, you know, considering external support right at the start, whether that's joining a network or finding peers in your sector or elsewhere that are similarly on a journey, or finding consultants who can help you with the technical basis. And then, well, decide on a framework. There are frameworks out there now. There's a lot of work in this space. And I'm just going to introduce two frameworks that are in development at the moment, gaining a lot of momentum. But first, just to contextualize, you know, what the journey that those frameworks might take you through, what that journey might be. This is from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. They've released just down the bottom there a great guide, practitioner's guide on all of this. But once again, as I emphasized in the last slide, you know, start with assessing and prioritizing those risks and opportunities. Locate where they are in your supply chain, in your operations. And then, you know, just bear in mind that this can be iterative. You don't have to work it out all in one go. Find out the key risks, you know, commit to some action on them, value them, and then come back again and see if there's anything else you can work on. And through that process, you will achieve a transformation in the business model and the risk. So I'm going to introduce TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and also SBTN after that, the Science-Based Targets for Nature. Now, in the first slide I presented of the journey over the last 150 years towards where we're at today, we're discussing nature positive, I mentioned finance, the finance industry, a few times. And I've observed that it's often been finance that's been the first driver for action. And here again, we see the finance sector and the demand for disclosing to your investors and the sources of equity and capital, and debt, what your financial risks are, to identify those and disclose them. And that's what the TNFD is all about. It's disclosing those risks for nature. And of course, this is building on the similar TCFD for climate, which is more or less being put into law, as most people will know in New Zealand, through the managed disclosures under the External Reporting Board. And there are the 4 steps. I've talked about this already. Essentially, locate where your impacts and dependencies are, evaluate them, prioritize them, think about the materiality of them, and then prepare to respond. There's a lot of detail in the TNFD. It's all in the open domain. It's going through testing at the moment. So there's 2 elements to TNFD. I've just presented the LEAP framework: locate, evaluate, assess, prioritize. And then the idea is you move from that through to actually making the disclosures. And there's 4 pillars, again, the same as climate. And here they are. So you would disclose on the governance, the way in which the business actually governs and manages risks, what their strategy is to deal with those, what the actual risk management framework is, how you actually identify and prioritize, and then what your metrics and targets might be. But TNFD itself does not give specific guidance on metrics and targets. And that's one of the most difficult things about nature. It's not like climate. 1 ton of carbon equivalent is a great metric. It's very easy. Everybody can understand that. It's fungible. With nature, it's a little bit more difficult. So there is the Science-Based Targets Network of the Global Commons Alliance. And again, this has been born of the climate movement. So there are many trillions of dollars of assets around the world in finance and companies that have signed up to the Science-Based Targets Initiative to set climate targets in line with the Paris Agreement. And the SBTN, the Science-Based Targets for Nature, has once again, like TNFD from TCFD, evolved from that climate targets group. And so the whole idea of SBTN is like climate. You have 1.5 degrees. That is set by science as being a safe limit before we enter potentially climate chaos. And the same principle applies to nature. We're trying to find out a science-based limit to safety for ecosystems. And so there you can see the action pathway that's been set out. There's a lot of resources out there on this, but essentially what it's trying to do is similar to the TNFD, but it's much more emphasized on measurement and setting targets and moving through the hierarchy of actions to reduce your impacts. So avoid them, reduce them, invest in restoration, and then transform the business model, again, towards nature positive. And penultimate slide, just wanted to emphasize the transformation a bit. Talked about it being an iterative cycle and transformation being an outcome of it. And here, again, this diagram is from Science-Based Targets for Nature. But it's important, I think, to think about, you might start with the direct operations or your most risky element of your supply chain. But then you can carry on to go through your entire value chain and then to work with partners within your value chain and within the areas that you operate. And then through that, together, we can achieve systemic change and can achieve transformation of business models. And the ultimate aim is to decouple the production of financial capital from the drawdown on natural capital. And just to close, as I said at the beginning, I've been very privileged to have been working with leaders in this sector really since the beginning of my career. And I recall working for some conservation charities who had some way back in the 90s, some partnerships with business. And back in those days, it was really just corporate, corporate branding. There was no real interaction with the value chain of the company, no understanding of nature benefits. It was just sort of, giving some money to a conservation charity. And now look where we are. We're seeing CEOs actually stand up and say, holding governments to account, saying we need nature targets. But from that journey, these are the lessons I would share. Leadership needs to be both top down and bottom up. You need buy-in from all levels. I've seen top down initiatives fail from that. Absolutely needs to be key performance indicators, and crucially for executives. Business case needs to be clear. And it's funny though, having all of that clarity, sometimes I've seen action being led by conviction of one or two leaders in an organisation before they've developed the business plan or had a pathway to achieve it. They just set that goal and then they work the details out later. And just to close, the last 3 years really has seen a transformation in perspectives. I think it's really driven by this recognition that nature's linked with climate, human health, and of course, supply chain risks. So thank you very much for your time. And now handing over.
Thanks very much, Robin. Okay, so what I will do is really put into context in a practitioner sense how Lyttleton Port is working with some of the frameworks that Robin has mentioned, the Science-Based Targets for Nature framework and the TNFD. But I'll kick off by saying just how we got involved on this journey, I guess. It was really through our relationship with Mana Whenua, who put out the wero to us. They threw out the challenge. We want to see the port take an approach which is no longer taking subtractions from this account of nature, but making deposits so that we end up with a net positive account. So this was around the time of Lyttleton Port recovering from the Christchurch earthquakes, and we had a really significant program of work in front of us. And so that conversation really landed with me and has really remained a bit of a touchstone for me in how we approach this nature work ongoing. You can see the situation of Lyttleton Port located here in Whakarapo. There's a significant footprint of the port's activities. Most of that land that you can see associated with the port there is reclaimed over time, but the port does other things such as dredging and disposal of material, as well as continuing to reclaim land. And we also have the quarry activity as well. So in order to manage those activities and understand how they might be having an effect on the environment and how we might alter that process, we invested significantly in environmental science programs. And I won't kind of go into detail here, but just to say that the significant investment in these programs has set us up really well now, sort of almost 6 or 7 years down the track, for where we're really trying to understand in detail, to use these frameworks to really sort of analyse where the impacts occur and to what extent that they might be occurring. But I would say that in this process was when we really started to develop nature literacy. And I think this has been really important for us, being able to land a strategy of aiming to be biodiversity positive and then relying on a framework to do that and having the business fully on board with that. I think this process of building up nature literacy was really important for us. And we had a deliberate strategy around that. We didn't just do the technical work, we did it in a way that also made sure that we communicated it effectively. Moving from there and that science understanding, one of the first steps that we've taken to apply these frameworks is to have a look at where our business intersects with all the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And so looking at the global information and distilled down to the New Zealand level, these are the drivers that need to be addressed in order to address the tangent of biodiversity loss. And so one of the first steps that we took as a business was to overlay what we do, the activities, development and operations across all of these different parameters. And it was a really useful first step. It was a great scan because it kind of helps make it tangible. You understand the points at which your business operations intersect with these activities, which are actually contributing to the biodiversity loss. And so if you think about the things that I mentioned that we do, land use and sea change. I mean, reclamation fits in there. Resource exploitation and extraction. I mean, we have a quarry. Contributions to climate change, pollution. I mean, we have major industrial facilities, stormwater discharge, industrial discharges. Invasive species is also another facet of port operations, with ballast water, marine introduced species potentially coming in through that pathway, as well as hull fouling, and then also the impact that we can have on managing predators on our land. So pretty soon you build up a really good picture of what that might look like for a business. And that was a really useful step. We then have started looking at the science-based target process. And while I won't go into a huge amount of detail here, I'll just say that we haven't done it in a linear way. So, and you can look at this layout and think, well, where are the natural steps that I can kind of make progress in? And certainly that first piece around understanding how you relate to those main drivers of biodiversity loss is a really important one. But you can also be gathering data in certain areas where you might need it, or developing partnerships, or in fact working on restoration programs. The good thing about this for me, and the thing that landed really strongly, is that fourth dot there around ACT. Action isn't just restoration. And I think for me, that's where my head went immediately when we started looking at how we delivered on this net gain ambition, or this biodiversity positive ambition. My head naturally went to restoration activities, and we do that. But if we only do that, we're not going to solve the biodiversity crisis. We have to do all of these things in unison. And so it's been really valuable as a business for us to look at what are the opportunities that we have across all of these dimensions of avoidance. It's really important. We can't continue the way we are if we're putting at risk significant areas of ecological value. We also need to reduce and turn down the dial on many activities that we're undertaking in order to manage those risks more effectively. But then comes in the element of restore and regenerate. And really importantly, I think, is this last point around transform. We can do everything else, but if we don't change the systems that we're operating within, and we don't transform those systems, then we can't solve this either. So this was really informative for me. And I think we've really, it's been certainly a big learning curve in trying to apply this process and use it. And my team are heavily involved right now in really looking at this in a lot of detail. But I do feel like we're learning a lot. And I think in terms of that transform piece, I think being able to collaborate and work with others who are on this journey as well, as more people start to apply these frameworks and use them, will be really, really valuable. So that's where I'm going to round things out today. Hopefully that's just given you a brief insight into the practicalities of how we're approaching it. But yeah, I'd be really keen to hand back to Megan, and maybe we can have some discussion and questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kim, Robin and Tahu. That was a really wonderful foundation for the conversation. I'll kick us off with a question, but if you do have any questions, please flick them through in the Q&A function or in the chat. Robin, given your immense experience, including some overseas, what companies have you seen leading the way in this space, and what is it that has meant their leaders?
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's interesting how I think over the last 10 years, it's evolved through the sectors. So perhaps 10, 15 years ago, it was the mining industry. And I think that probably came from, the fact that perhaps they make more money, per the scale of their footprint, but also that they were under a lot of scrutiny. The impacts are incredibly obvious. And so, companies like, Rio Tinto was the first company actually of any to come up with the biodiversity net loss policy. But then, stemming on from that, we saw it over the last sort of, 5 years extend out to, companies like Kering. Kering were the first, so that's a fashion brand conglomerate. They were the first to bring up the concept of environmental profit and loss, to actually put that into their annual report, to look at their whole supply chain and think about nature impacts. Another leader has been L'Oreal, the personal care company. yeah, other leaders as well. Unilever, they put out a $1 billion fund 3 years ago for restoration and regeneration in their supply chains for their food and beverage brands. So yeah, there are many. And I would say also Lyttleton Port, in New Zealand, they've been doing this mahi for some years now, and providing leadership nationally and also within their group of companies, Christchurch City Holdings. So many leaders all across the world in different sectors, and they tend to bring their peers along with them, in my experience.
Wonderful, and that seems like a definite sign of leadership, is bringing others with you on that journey. We've had a question, I think, probably for Kim and for Tahu. The coastal marine area is a receiving environment. How do you positively influence land use effects outside your control through this framework? That's the first part of the question. And then can you easily extend it to other partners? The second part.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Two things. Initially, we are working on trying to develop our inventory in terms of the footprint that we have in terms of our direct inputs. What is LPC responsible for? But we can't lose sight of the fact that there are multiple drivers in play at any one time, and so the results of those impacts can be associated with a number of different drivers in play and different sources of impact. So we have to work with other organisations and partners, and so one way of doing that is we work within a Whakaora partnership, a Healthy Harbour partnership that includes the councils and Ngāi Tahu as well as Mana Whenua directly. And so that's a fantastic opportunity to work together to get to some common understandings about the state of the environment and what needs to be done about those elements, where action needs to be taken. But ultimately, we do want to understand really clearly what our footprint is, what is our contribution, and what do we need to do as a company in order to get into the positive. But we can't lose sight of the fact that we're not the only one doing this and not the only one having effects, and that we have to work together to make progress. So partnerships and collaborations.
We've had a prompt follow-up question of, does it address the cumulative effects?
Robin, that might be a good one for you to answer in terms of how the framework deals with cumulative effects.
Yeah, sure. So this sort of gets into some of the more detailed, scope questions. And I think it's important to note that with sort of science-based targets framework, those things are still being discussed, exactly what the scope is. So I'm referring to here whether you're including just the direct impacts of your operations, thinking about the supply chain, thinking beyond direct, indirect, how things start to interact, and of course cumulative. So that's in terms of the scoping. I would say though, in terms of Lyttleton Harbour, the cumulative impacts are addressed through the partnership and through the partnership solution. So the idea, what we're going through is, we've talked quite a bit about, identifying impacts and sort of setting those accounts. But the idea is to go from there to recovery and to set recovery goals for, in this case, Lyttleton Harbour as a marine area, but also the catchment that influences that area with the different parts. Because of course, Lyttleton Port, even if they get to positive versus their own impacts, that's not going to necessarily transform Whakaopō to being a thriving environment. And so you need to do that with the other partners and inspire the other partners, communities, Mana Whenua, etc. And that, I think, is where the cumulative effects comes in. But yes, in direct answer to the question, when you're thinking about it in terms of the impacts and how significant they are, yes, cumulative effects have been taken into account, but that's not specifically required by science-based targets yet. It's still being negotiated.
Thank you, Robin. Another question is for Kim and Robin. So keen to hear any examples of ways that Lyttleton Port or others have found to make their own core operations and activities positive for nature and the direct impacts they have, perhaps moving to a different model or technology.
I could jump in with a quick example of that first, and then maybe Robin might want to follow up with some broader examples. But a quick one is, so some of the direct work that we do, for example, is the construction of port infrastructure, so infrastructure in the marine environment. So there's a process now that we're going through of examining eco-engineering options. So if we're going to place structures in the marine environment, whether they're rock walls or breakwaters or wharves, whatever that might be, how do we design that in a way that's more ecologically relevant? And there's fantastic examples from around the world about how that's done at the moment. And so we're embarking on that process to make sure that what we do is of a greater ecological relevance. It still serves the purpose for being a breakwater or a seawall or those functions that it needs to perform, but it's also something that is more likely to have a positive impact in terms of ecological outcomes than just a traditional design. So that's just one example.
Yeah, I'd like to bring an example. I suppose taking a step back, if we think of the problem at a large scale, it's essentially a problem with business models being unsustainable, and I think there's an enormous opportunity to replace unsustainable business models with more sustainable business models. An example, a project we're working on in Paraguay is it's a large scale project, and it's an area where it's had unsustainable grazing and burning practices, extensive cattle ranching. And they're taking advantage now of new markets, so premium carbon markets where investors are wanting to invest in natural climate solutions, and they're transforming the land use of that area to sustainable forest management, native forest management, charcoal production, biochar production, sale of carbon credits, and also in the more degraded areas, introducing production forestry. And so that's an example of how you can just take a step back and say, well, how can we change the use of this area? How can we introduce a more sustainable business model?
Thank you, Robin. With a mindfulness for time, as we expected, it's been a really good session that's run through the full hour. So thank you so much to Tahu, Robin and Kim. It was great to hear about the growing work in this space and the connection to our ancestors in the past and the obligations that we have to future ancestors, along with some of those practical frameworks that are emerging. I think everyone on the call is probably conscious that that was a whistle-stop tour and there is so much more depth in that. And so we did want to just run a quick poll to see where to next for people on this call and their organisations. What would be the most helpful next step to support you in your organisation on that nature biodiversity journey? So if you can have a read of that, that'd be great. Give you a couple of seconds, then we'll also leave that running. In the meantime, we will also send through an email today with some information that's come up. Robin has kindly said that he will be happy to share his slides, which is great. If you would like to get in touch with Robin, it's naturepositive.co.nz. We'll pop that through in the email too. But again, thank you so much to everyone for joining. I will hand over to Tahu for a closing karakia, and then we will leave you.
Kia ora, Megan. Kia ora, everybody. Aroha mai. Sorry that I sort of went over my limit, but I digress. So we'll do a little karakia to finish off. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kena ki uta, ki mā taratara ki tai. He hia ke ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu. Cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with the sharpened air, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. Have a glorious day. Ka kite anō.